Don't let Grandma embarrass us again. I heard my son whisper those words just outside the auditorium doors at my grandson's high school graduation. And in that moment, something inside me went painfully quiet. He didn't know I was standing only a few feet away behind the large blue banner near the entrance, holding the graduation card I had spent nearly an hour choosing for Jacob. I stayed perfectly still as Ryan adjusted his tie and glanced nervously toward the crowd gathering inside the school gymnasium. Just keep her away from the front rows, my daughter-in-law Melissa replied softly. We already talked about this. Ryan let out a tired sigh. I know. I just don't want another scene. Another scene. I stared down at the white envelope trembling slightly in my hands. The words felt strange in my chest, like I had accidentally walked into the wrong family's conversation. For a second, I honestly wondered if they were talking about someone else. Then Melissa looked directly toward the hallway where I stood hidden from view and lowered her voice even more. As long as she doesn't start crying or talking too much, we'll get through today. Get through today. As if my presence at my own grandson's graduation was some kind of burden they needed to survive. I slowly stepped backward before they could notice me and smoothed my hands over the front of my pale lavender jacket. I had bought it 2 weeks earlier because Jacob once told me lavender made me look elegant. I remembered smiling all afternoon after he said it. Funny how one kind sentence from a grandchild can stay in a grandmother's heart for months. I took a slow breath and walked into the gymnasium as though I had heard nothing at all. I'm glad you're here, the woman checking tickets said kindly as she handed me a program. I smiled back automatically. The gym smelled faintly of polished floors, flowers, and overheated air conditioning. Families filled nearly every row, proud parents waving phones, younger siblings running between chairs, grandparents carrying bouquets and balloons. The entire room buzzed with excitement and noise, but I suddenly felt strangely invisible standing there alone. I spotted Ryan and Melissa near the front section reserved for family members. Melissa wore a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill, and Ryan stood beside her checking his watch every few seconds like an anxious businessman instead of a father attending his son's graduation. For a moment, I considered walking over to them anyway, pretending everything was normal. Pretending I hadn't just heard my own son speak about me with embarrassment in his voice. But before I could move, Melissa noticed me. Her smile appeared instantly, polished and practiced. Helen, she called, waving one hand carefully. You made it. Made it. Not, we're happy you're here. Not, Jacob will be so excited. Just made it. I walked toward them slowly. Ryan kissed my cheek without really looking at me. Hey, Mom. His voice sounded distracted. Melissa gently touched my elbow and pointed toward the back section of seats. We saved you a spot over there. The lighting's actually much better for pictures. I followed her hand with my eyes. The seat was nearly at the very end of the gymnasium, beside the folding exit doors. Far away from the family section. Far away from Jacob. Oh, I said softly. Of course. Ryan cleared his throat awkwardly. It's crowded this year. I understand, I replied. And I did understand. Much more than they realized. I walked alone to the back row and sat down carefully, placing Jacob's graduation card neatly on my lap. From there, the stage looked smaller somehow. Distant. I watched family after family laugh together while taking photographs near the front rows. Every now and then, Ryan glanced behind him toward me with the same nervous expression people use when checking whether a problem has gotten worse. That hurt more than the words themselves. Because once upon a time, Ryan used to search for me in every crowd. When he was little, he'd wave wildly the second he spotted me at school plays or baseball games. That's my mom, he used to say proudly. But now he couldn't even let me sit beside him at his own son's graduation. The ceremony began a few minutes later. Music filled the gym as the graduates entered in blue caps and gowns. Parents stood immediately, cheering and clapping loudly. I stood too, searching every face until I finally saw Jacob walking proudly near the center row. My sweet grandson looked so grown up suddenly. Taller than Ryan now. Confident. Handsome. For one brief moment, he turned toward the audience, scanning the crowd. I lifted my hand slightly, smiling through the sting building behind my eyes. But before Jacob could see me, Melissa stepped directly in front of Ryan, holding up her phone for a photo, blocking his view completely. And somehow, sitting alone in that back row while the entire room celebrated together, I realized something painful. They didn't just think I was old. They thought I was something to hide. The graduates had barely finished taking their seats when the memories started returning to me one after another, quiet and sharp, like tiny cracks spreading across glass. Sitting alone near the back of that crowded gymnasium, I realized this was not the first time I had been carefully pushed to the edges of my own family. It was simply the first time I had stopped making excuses for it. I kept my eyes on the stage while the principal welcomed everyone, but my mind drifted backward through years of small moments I had once dismissed as misunderstandings. 3 years ago, when Jacob made the varsity baseball team, I drove nearly 40 miles every Friday night just to watch him play under those bright stadium lights. I never missed a game unless there was snow on the roads. I used to bring homemade brownies wrapped in foil because Jacob loved them after practice. But one evening, after I arrived early and climbed the bleachers carrying my little cooler bag, Melissa walked over with that same polished smile she always wore in public. "Helen," she said gently, glancing around at the other parents nearby, "maybe keep the cheering down tonight. Jacob gets embarrassed easily." Embarrassed. I remember laughing softly at the time because I thought she was joking. But during the entire game, I barely clapped above a whisper. Another memory surfaced before I could stop it. Thanksgiving 2 years ago, I had spent nearly 10 hours cooking a full dinner for everyone. Because Ryan insisted the family wanted to celebrate at my house again. I polished the silverware, ironed the linen napkins, and even used the expensive candles I had been saving since my anniversary with my late husband. By 6 o'clock, nobody had arrived. Melissa finally texted me at almost 7:30, saying they had accepted a last-minute invitation from friends in the city. "We figured you would understand," the message read. I ate reheated stuffing alone at my kitchen table while the turkey dried out in the oven. The next morning, Jacob posted pictures online of everyone smiling around another family's dining room. Melissa looked elegant in a dark green sweater dress, one hand resting proudly on Ryan's shoulder like she had built that perfect little life all by herself. I stared at those pictures for nearly an hour, searching for some sign that they had missed me too. There was none. Back then, I convinced myself families changed as children grew older. I told myself I was being too sensitive. But sitting in that graduation ceremony, watching Ryan laugh comfortably with the people seated around him while I sat alone near the exit doors, the truth finally settled heavily inside me. This had never been accidental. It had been gradual, careful, quiet. Melissa had never openly pushed me away. She simply rearranged the room until I no longer belonged in it. The applause suddenly erupted around me as one of the honor students finished speaking. I blinked quickly and straightened in my chair, embarrassed by how far my thoughts had drifted. Up front, Melissa stood to take more pictures while Ryan leaned toward another couple, smiling politely, as if this were the happiest day of his life. I studied my son carefully from across the crowded gymnasium. His hair had started turning gray near the temples recently. There were lines around his eyes now that had not been there before. For just a second, I could still see the little boy who used to wait by the front window every evening for me to come home from work. "Mom's here," he would shout excitedly whenever my car pulled into the driveway. He used to run straight into my arms without caring who was watching. Somewhere, over the years, that little boy disappeared. And somehow, I had not noticed until today. Then, as the graduates began lining up row by row to receive their diplomas, I watched Melissa lean closer to Ryan and quietly say something that made them both glance back toward me again. Ryan immediately looked away the second our eyes met, and that hurt more than if he had simply stared. When Jacob's name was finally called, the entire gymnasium exploded into applause. Ryan jumped to his feet immediately, clapping loudly with the proud excitement of a father celebrating his only son. Melissa stood beside him, recording everything on her phone, smiling brightly toward the stage as though this moment belonged entirely to the two of them. I stood too, of course. My hands came together softly while I watched my grandson cross the stage in his blue graduation gown. Jacob looked confident, accepting his diploma, taller and older than the little boy who used to sit at my kitchen counter eating pancakes on Saturday mornings. For one brief second, he glanced toward the audience again. This time our eyes met. I smiled warmly and lifted my hand in a small wave. His expression softened immediately. "Grandma," he mouthed silently across the crowded gymnasium. Then Melissa quickly stepped closer to him near the edge of the stage where families were gathering for photographs. She adjusted his gown, straightened his cap, and turned him toward Ryan for pictures before Jacob could look back at me again. I slowly lowered my hand. Around me, families were already beginning to move toward the front rows. Mothers hugged their children tightly. Fathers slapped backs proudly. Grandparents carried bouquets of flowers wrapped in bright paper. The entire room filled with movement and laughter, but I remained standing alone near my folding chair for several seconds longer than necessary, because suddenly I did not know where I belonged in all of it. Eventually, I picked up my purse and walked carefully down the crowded aisle toward the lobby. I told myself I would wait there quietly until Ryan or Jacob came looking for me. Surely they would. Outside the gymnasium, families crowded the hallways taking photographs beside blue and gold graduation banners. Balloons floated near the ceiling. Somewhere nearby, someone had opened a tray of catered sandwiches because the faint smell of roast beef and mustard drifted through the air. I stepped to the side near one of the large windows and waited patiently, holding Jacob's graduation card against my chest. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. People continued walking around me in happy little groups while I stood alone pretending not to notice. Finally, I spotted Ryan and Melissa at the far end of the hallway surrounded by relatives from Melissa's side of the family. Everyone laughed loudly while phones flashed for pictures. Jacob stood in the center smiling politely as different family members pulled him into photographs one after another. I watched quietly, expecting Ryan to wave me over at any moment. He never did. Then I heard Melissa's voice again. "Make sure we get one without too many people in the background," she said while glancing around carefully. "I want to frame this one." Ryan nodded distractedly. One of Melissa's sisters looked toward me, standing alone near the window. "Should we ask Helen to join?" she asked politely. Before Ryan could answer, Melissa gave a quick little smile. "Oh, she probably wants to head home soon. Crowds overwhelm her these days." "Overwhelm me." I almost laughed at how easily she said it, as though she had spent years carefully creating a softer version of the truth. Not unwanted, not excluded, just overwhelmed. Ryan never corrected her. He simply kept smiling for the next photograph, while Jacob looked briefly confused, searching the crowd again. I felt something inside me grow very still then. Not anger exactly. Something colder. Clearer. For years, I had kept adjusting myself to fit inside the shrinking space they allowed me in their lives. I spoke more quietly, visited less often, tried not to interfere. I convinced myself I was respecting boundaries when really I was slowly disappearing from my own family, one polite compromise at a time. A woman standing beside me suddenly smiled kindly. She appeared to be around my age with silver blonde hair pinned neatly behind her ears and a navy blue jacket decorated with a small corsage. "Graduations can feel emotional, can they not?" she said gently. I nodded politely. "Yes, they can." She glanced toward Ryan and Melissa still taking pictures. Then back at me. "Forgive me for saying this," she said carefully, "but decent sons usually do not leave their mothers standing alone." Her words settled heavily in my chest because they were spoken without cruelty, just honesty. And somehow honesty hurt more. The woman beside me introduced herself as Linda Morrison. Her grandson had graduated with Jacob, and while the hallway around us buzzed with celebration, Linda spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had already lived long enough to recognize sadness when she saw it. "Would you like to sit for a moment?" she asked gently, motioning toward a pair of empty folding chairs near the vending machines. I almost said no out of habit. For years, I had trained myself not to inconvenience anyone, but my feet suddenly felt heavier than usual, so I nodded quietly and followed her. We sat side by side while families continued taking pictures nearby. Linda rested her small purse on her lap and studied the crowd thoughtfully before speaking again. "I noticed you standing alone during most of the ceremony," she said carefully. "That should never happen to a mother at a family celebration." I forced a polite smile. "Everyone gets busy during these things." Linda gave me a long look over the top of her glasses. "Busy is forgetting extra napkins at Thanksgiving. Busy is not abandoning your mother in a hallway while strangers celebrate around her." Her honesty caught me off guard. Most people softened uncomfortable truths. Linda did not. She spoke quietly, but directly. For some reason, that made me trust her immediately. I looked down at Jacob's graduation card still resting in my hands. The edges had started bending slightly from how tightly I had been holding it all afternoon. "I think maybe I stopped noticing certain things," I admitted softly. Linda nodded slowly like someone hearing a familiar story. That happens when people mistreat you gradually, she said. You adjust little by little until one day you realize you disappeared from your own life. Her words settled deeply inside me because they sounded painfully true. We sat in silence for a moment watching another family gather for photographs near the entrance. A little girl ran laughing into her grandmother's arms while everyone around them smiled warmly. I looked away before the ache in my chest grew worse. Then Linda leaned slightly closer. I hope you do not mind me saying this, she said quietly, but I have heard your daughter-in-law speak about you before. I looked up immediately. Melissa? Linda hesitated only briefly before nodding. A few months ago at the Booster Club brunch downtown, some of the mothers and grandmothers were talking after the fundraiser ended. My stomach tightened. Linda continued carefully. She laughed about how difficult family events become when you are around. She said Ryan gets nervous because you sometimes make things awkward. Awkward. The word landed harder than I expected. I swallowed slowly while staring down at my hands. Linda's expression softened slightly. I almost said something then, she admitted. But honestly, I assumed your son would defend you. I gave a small laugh before I could stop myself. It sounded tired even to me. Ryan avoids conflict. No, Linda replied gently. There is a difference between avoiding conflict and allowing disrespect. Her words stayed with me long after she spoke them. Because deep down, I already knew she was right. Ryan had not become cruel overnight. He had simply learned that silence was easier than standing beside me. Somewhere along the years, keeping Melissa comfortable had become more important than protecting his mother's dignity. I watched him across the hallway again. He stood smiling beside Jacob, while Melissa carefully arranged everyone for another photograph. Every movement she made looked polished and effortless, like someone directing a magazine advertisement instead of a family moment. Then Jacob suddenly looked past the crowd and spotted me sitting beside Linda. His face brightened immediately. He lifted one hand and started moving toward me. Before he could reach us, Melissa touched his arm and pointed him back toward another group photo. Jacob hesitated for a second, glancing toward me apologetically before turning back around. I smiled anyway and gave him a reassuring little nod. But something changed quietly inside me right then. Not dramatic, not explosive, just clear. For the first time, I stopped blaming myself for the distance growing inside my family. And once that happened, I began seeing everything differently. The graduation reception finally began winding down around late afternoon. Families slowly gathered their flowers and gift bags while students drifted across the parking lot taking final photographs beside decorated cars covered in congratulatory messages. I remained seated beside Linda near the hallway windows longer than I probably should have. Somehow sitting next to someone who spoke honestly felt safer than returning to my own family. Do you have plans after this? Linda asked kindly as she slipped on her light sweater. Ryan mentioned dinner earlier this week. I replied quietly, although I am not entirely sure whether I was actually included. Linda gave me a look filled with sympathy that somehow did not feel pitying. People reveal themselves very clearly during celebrations, she said softly. Weddings, funerals, graduations. Those are the moments when masks slip. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed lightly inside my purse. I pulled it out expecting perhaps a message from Jacob. Instead, it was an accidental video notification from social media. Melissa had already uploaded pictures from the ceremony less than 20 minutes earlier. I stared at the screen silently. The first photograph showed Ryan hugging Jacob proudly beneath the graduation banner. The second showed Melissa adjusting Jacob's cap, while both of them smiled directly into the camera like a magazine advertisement for the perfect American family. The third photo included Melissa's parents, her sisters, and even a distant cousin holding flowers. I kept swiping slowly through every image. My chest tightened more with each one. There was not a single photograph of me anywhere. Not one. It was as though I had never attended at all. Linda watched my expression carefully. What is it? She asked gently. Without speaking, I handed her the phone. She scrolled quietly for several seconds before exhaling softly through her nose. Oh, Helen. That was all she said. But somehow those two words carried more kindness than I had felt from my own son all day. I took the phone back and stared at the smiling faces on the screen again. Then I noticed the caption Melissa had written beneath the photos. Celebrating Jacob with the people who supported him every step of the way. Supported him every step of the way. I almost laughed out loud sitting there beneath those fluorescent school lights. When Jacob was 9 years old and Ryan lost his job during the recession, it was my retirement savings that quietly covered Jacob's private tutoring so he would not fall behind in school. When Melissa wanted Jacob enrolled in summer science camp 3 years later, I wrote the check because Ryan admitted they could not afford the tuition that year. I had spent countless afternoons driving Jacob to piano lessons, dentist appointments, baseball practices, and debate club meetings while Ryan worked overtime and Melissa focused on building her real estate business. I did those things gladly because I loved my grandson more than anything. But now, looking at Melissa's carefully edited version of reality, I realized something painful. They had rewritten the family story in a way that erased every sacrifice I ever made. And worse than that, they seemed perfectly comfortable with it. My phone buzzed again moments later. This time it was a direct text from Melissa. "We are heading to dinner at Verona Grill. It might be loud and crowded for you, so do not feel pressured to come if you are tired." I read the message twice slowly. Not once did she actually invite me. Linda looked over quietly. "You know," she said carefully, "sometimes people offer concern when what they really mean is inconvenience." I stared down at the text for a long moment before locking my phone screen. Then, for the first time all day, I felt something inside me shift completely. The sadness was still there, heavy and aching. But underneath it, another feeling slowly emerged. Clarity. I was suddenly tired of pretending these small humiliations were accidents. Tired of shrinking myself to protect other people's comfort. Across the parking lot, I watched Ryan helping Melissa load flowers into the back of their expensive SUV while Jacob stood nearby, talking with friends. My son looked exhausted, distracted, older than his 50 years. And all at once, I saw something I had somehow missed before. Ryan was not protecting his family from embarrassment. He was protecting the image Melissa had built around their lives. An image where I no longer fit. That evening, I did not go to dinner at Verona Grill. I sent Ryan a short message saying I felt tired and wanted to head home early. He replied almost immediately with a thumbs-up emoji and nothing else. No phone call. No concern. No attempt to convince me to come anyway. Somehow that hurt more than Melissa's carefully polite text earlier. I drove home slowly through the warm June evening with the windows cracked slightly open. Graduation banners fluttered from front porches all across town, while families filled restaurants celebrating their children's futures. At every red light, I kept seeing flashes of Jacob's face in my mind. His proud smile on stage. The brief confusion in his eyes when Melissa redirected him away from me. I knew my grandson loved me. That was never the question. The problem was something quieter and far more dangerous. Children slowly learn how to treat people by watching the adults around them. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun had already started dipping below the trees. My small brick house looked peaceful in the fading light. The flower boxes beneath the front windows were overflowing with white petunias because gardening was one of the few hobbies I still genuinely enjoyed. For years, Ryan used to tease me about those flowers. "Mom, you treat those plants better than most people treat their children," he once joked while helping me water them during a drought. Back then, he used to come by almost every Sunday. That changed after Melissa started building her real estate business. Slowly, family dinners became monthly visits. Then birthdays only. Then mostly holidays. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet house. The silence wrapped around me immediately. Normally, after family events, I would sit at the kitchen table replaying every conversation in my mind, searching for ways I could have behaved better. Maybe I talked too much. Maybe I stayed too long. Maybe I embarrassed Ryan somehow without realizing it. But tonight felt different. Tonight, for the first time in years, I stopped dissecting myself and started examining them instead. I placed my purse carefully on the counter and noticed the stack of unopened mail beside the coffee maker. Most of it was ordinary things. Utility bills, grocery coupons, a retirement newsletter. But one envelope caught my attention immediately because I recognized Ryan's handwriting. I opened it slowly and pulled out a folded bank statement. For a moment, I stared at it in confusion before remembering. 3 years ago, when Ryan and Melissa refinanced their home during a difficult financial stretch, Ryan asked if he could temporarily use one of my savings accounts as backup documentation for the bank approval process. Just paperwork, he had assured me at the time. Nothing complicated. I trusted him completely, so I agreed without hesitation. Since then, Occasional mortgage notices still accidentally arrived at my address because the paperwork had never been fully updated. Usually, I mailed them directly to Ryan without even opening them. Tonight, however, something made me pause. I unfolded the statement slowly beneath the kitchen light. Then I sat down very carefully at the table. The account was overdue. Not by a few dollars. By several months. I kept reading. Late notices. Payment warnings. Final reminders. My stomach tightened as realization slowly settled over me. Ryan and Melissa were struggling financially far more than they had admitted. Suddenly, dozens of little details from the past year rearranged themselves inside my mind. Melissa quietly canceling family vacations. Ryan selling his boat last fall after insisting he did not use it enough anymore. The nervous tension between them during Christmas shopping. Even today at graduation, Ryan's expensive suit had looked slightly worn near the cuffs. I leaned back slowly in my chair, staring at the paperwork spread across the table. All this time, while Melissa carefully curated their perfect life online, cracks had already been forming beneath the surface. And then another realization followed close behind. During the past 5 years alone, I had quietly helped them more times than I could count. Tuition payments, emergency car repairs, medical deductibles, school fees, always framed as temporary help, always accompanied by embarrassed promises to repay me someday. I never kept score because families are supposed to help one another. But now, sitting alone in my quiet kitchen while remembering Melissa's caption about the people who supported Jacob every step of the way, something cold and undeniable finally settled into place. They did not see me as family anymore. They saw me as useful. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Sunlight filtered softly through the kitchen curtains while the coffee maker hummed quietly beside me. But for the first time in years, my thoughts felt strangely calm. Not peaceful exactly, just settled. The kind of calm that comes after finally accepting something painful you have avoided for too long. I carried my coffee to the dining room table and spread out the mortgage notices again beneath the morning light. Beside them, I placed an old leather folder I had not opened in months. Inside were copies of checks, wire transfers, tuition receipts, and handwritten notes from Ryan over the years. Just until next month, Mom. We are really grateful. You saved us again. I read through them slowly one by one while the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily in the background. There were more documents than I remembered. Much more. I found the receipt for Jacob's orthodontic treatment from when Ryan's insurance unexpectedly changed coverage. Then the paperwork from Melissa's emergency surgery 5 years ago when their deductible nearly emptied their checking account. I even found copies of property tax payments from 2 separate years when Ryan quietly admitted they were behind. Each memory returned clearly now. Every time I helped them. Melissa always acted uncomfortable afterward, but not because she disliked taking the money. She disliked the reminder that they still needed me. Around noon, my phone rang. Ryan's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a moment before answering. "Hi, Mom," he said quickly. He sounded distracted, like someone multitasking while talking. "I just wanted to check whether you made it home all right yesterday." Yesterday, nearly 20 hours later. "I made it home fine," I replied calmly. Good, good." Silence followed for several seconds. Then he cleared his throat awkwardly. "Melissa thought maybe you seemed upset at graduation." I looked down at the stack of financial documents spread across my table. "Did she? You know how crowded those events get," he continued carefully. "If anything came across wrong yesterday, I am sure nobody meant it that way." Nobody meant it that way. For years, Ryan had hidden behind phrases like that. Soft little sentences that erased accountability without ever addressing the actual hurt. I stirred my coffee slowly. "Ryan," I said quietly, "when was the last time you invited me somewhere because you genuinely wanted me there?" Silence. Long silence. I could hear faint office noises behind him, keyboards clicking somewhere nearby. "Mom, come on," he finally muttered. "Why are we doing this today?" Because today I was no longer willing to pretend. But I did not say that aloud. Instead, I asked something else. "How bad are things financially?" The silence on the other end changed immediately. Sharper this time. "Careful. What are you talking about?" "The mortgage notices still come here sometimes," I replied evenly. "I opened one last night." Ryan exhaled heavily under his breath. "It is temporary," he said quickly. "The market slowed down for Melissa this year, and a few investments did not work out the way we expected. I listened quietly while staring out the dining room window at my flower garden, swaying gently in the breeze. "We are handling it," he added after a moment, though his voice sounded more defensive than confident. I almost asked whether they were truly handling it or simply surviving one delayed payment at a time. Instead, I asked the question sitting deepest in my chest. "Ryan," I said softly, "are you ashamed of me?" The silence that followed felt endless. Finally, he sighed tiredly. "Mom, nobody is ashamed of you." But he did not sound convincing. He sounded exhausted, cornered. "Melissa just worries sometimes that you say things that make social situations uncomfortable." Social situations. Not family moments. Not love. Not dignity. Just social situations. I closed my eyes briefly. "I see," I whispered. "You are overthinking all of this," Ryan replied quickly. "You always take things too personally." There it was. The sentence people use when they want your pain to become your fault. I opened my eyes slowly and looked again at the years of receipts spread across the table between my hands. Then I realized something strange. Ryan genuinely believed I would continue helping them forever, no matter how they treated me. Not because he was evil, but because I always had. "Mom?" he asked cautiously when I did not respond. I took a slow breath before speaking. "I think it is time we have dinner together," I said calmly. "All of us." 3 nights later, Ryan and Melissa arrived at my house just after 6:30 in the evening. Jacob came with them, still carrying the relaxed confidence of a teenager fresh out of high school, though I noticed he looked slightly uncomfortable the moment he stepped through the front door. Melissa entered first, holding a bottle of expensive wine like a peace offering, while Ryan followed behind, checking his phone one last time before slipping it into his pocket. "The house smells wonderful," Melissa said brightly as she looked around the dining room. I had cooked one of Ryan's favorite meals: pot roast with carrots, mashed potatoes, fresh green beans, and the lemon pie he always requested on birthdays when he was younger. The dining room table looked beautiful beneath the warm overhead light. Cloth napkins, candles, my best china. For years, I believed family dinners could repair almost anything. Tonight, however, I understood something different. Sometimes a table simply reveals what has already been broken. "Grandma, the pie smells amazing," Jacob said with a genuine smile as he hugged me tightly. I held on to him for a second longer than usual. "Congratulations again, sweetheart," I whispered. "I am very proud of you." Ryan glanced around the room awkwardly. "Everything looks great, Mom." I smiled politely. "Sit down before the food gets cold." Dinner started quietly enough. Jacob talked about college orientation while Melissa described a new luxury property listing she hoped to close later that summer. Ryan laughed at the appropriate moments, though I noticed the shadows beneath his eyes looked darker than they had at graduation. The financial pressure was wearing on him more than he admitted. Halfway through dinner, Melissa carefully folded her napkin and smiled toward me. "We really appreciated all the support over the years with Jacob," she said smoothly. "Family makes milestones like graduation possible." The words sounded polished, practiced, like something meant for an audience instead of a conversation. I looked at her calmly across the candlelight. "That is true," I replied softly. "Support matters very much." Then I reached beside my chair and lifted the leather folder onto the table. Ryan's expression changed instantly. Not panic exactly. Recognition. I placed the folder gently between us. "What is that?" Melissa asked lightly, though I noticed her smile tightened slightly near the corners. "Just a few things I thought we should all look at together," I said. I opened the folder slowly and removed the first stack of papers. Tuition receipts, medical bills, mortgage notices, bank transfers. One by one, I spread them carefully across the dining room table like pieces of a story nobody else had wanted to acknowledge. The room grew quieter with every page. Jacob stopped eating entirely. Ryan stared downward at the paperwork without speaking. Melissa's posture stiffened beside him. "I kept copies of everything over the years," I said calmly. "Mostly because your father always taught me to stay organized." Ryan rubbed one hand across his forehead. "Mom." "No," I interrupted gently. "Let me finish." My voice remained soft, but for the first time in years, nobody tried to redirect me. I paid for tutoring when Jacob struggled in middle school. I covered property taxes twice. I paid medical deductibles, summer tuition, car repairs, groceries during the recession. I looked directly at Ryan, and I did all of it happily because I believed family should help one another. Melissa shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Helen, nobody denies you have helped us. I turned toward her slowly. Then why does your version of family erase me? Silence filled the room immediately. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway suddenly sounded louder. Melissa opened her mouth slightly, but no words came out. I looked back at Ryan. At graduation, I heard what you said. His face drained of color almost instantly. Mom, do not, I said quietly. Do not insult me further by pretending I misunderstood. Jacob looked sharply toward his father in confusion. Ryan stared down at the table, unable to meet my eyes. And suddenly, after years of shrinking myself to protect everyone else's comfort, I realized something powerful. The truth did not require yelling. It only required being spoken aloud. Nobody spoke for several long seconds after my words settled over the table. The candles flickered softly between us while the untouched pie cooled on the kitchen counter behind me. Ryan still stared downward at the paperwork spread across the table, as though he hoped the documents might somehow disappear if he avoided looking directly at them. Melissa sat perfectly still beside him, her polished confidence finally beginning to crack around the edges. Only Jacob looked from face to face, openly confused, trying to understand how an ordinary family dinner had suddenly exposed something much larger, hiding underneath it for years. Dad, he finally said carefully, what is Grandma talking about? Ryan swallowed hard before answering. It is complicated. I almost smiled sadly at that because complicated is the word people use when the truth makes them uncomfortable. Jacob looked toward me instead. Grandma. His voice sounded softer now, younger somehow. I folded my hands calmly together on the table. Your parents have been under financial pressure for a while, I explained gently. I helped where I could because families are supposed to support one another. Jacob glanced down at the mortgage notices and tuition receipts scattered across the table. His eyes widened slightly as realization slowly settled in. You paid for all this? Ryan finally lifted his head. Mom did not have to bring all this up tonight. There was frustration in his voice now, but underneath it, I heard embarrassment too. No, I replied quietly. I should have brought it up years ago. Melissa suddenly straightened in her chair. Helen, if this is about graduation, you are blowing everything completely out of proportion. I looked at her steadily across the table. Am I? Her jaw tightened slightly. Nobody was trying to hurt you. Intentions do not erase humiliation, I said softly. Especially repeated humiliation. Ryan closed his eyes briefly like a man exhausted by a problem he no longer knew how to avoid. Mom, please, he muttered. You always take things emotionally. I stared at my son for a long moment then. Really stared at him. At the gray beginning to spread through his hair. At the deep tiredness beneath his eyes. At the man who once cried in my arms because another child mocked his second-hand sneakers in 4th grade. Back then, I taught him never to make people feel small just to protect his own pride. Somewhere along the years, he forgot that lesson. Ryan, I said quietly, you were never embarrassed by me. He looked up slowly. You were embarrassed that you still needed me. The silence afterward felt enormous. Melissa looked away immediately. Jacob stared at his father in stunned disbelief. And Ryan finally looked like someone seeing himself clearly for the first time in years. His shoulders sagged slightly as though all the energy had drained from him at once. That is not fair, he whispered weakly. No, I replied gently. What was unfair was making me feel unwanted while still depending on me behind the scenes. Nobody argued after that because there was nothing left to deny. The truth sat openly between us now beside the dirty dinner plates and folded napkins. I slowly stood from the table and began gathering the paperwork back into the leather folder one piece at a time. Jacob suddenly pushed back his chair. Grandma, wait. I looked at him softly. His eyes looked glossy now, full of the kind of confusion that comes when childhood illusions suddenly crack apart. I did not know, he said quietly. I swear I did not know. And unlike the carefully polished excuses I had heard from his parents all evening, Jacob's words sounded honest. I walked around the table and gently touched his shoulder. I know you did not, sweetheart. Ryan opened his mouth as though he wanted to say something too, but no words came out. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he finally understood that silence could wound people just as deeply as cruelty. I picked up my folder calmly and moved toward the hallway. Nobody tried stopping me. At the front door, I paused briefly and looked back once more at the family sitting around my dining room table. The same table where I had celebrated birthdays, Christmas mornings, and report cards for decades. They looked smaller somehow now. Not because I hated them, but because I finally stopped shrinking myself for their comfort. Then I quietly turned off the dining room light and walked